Good morning, everyone. I'm Leanne Beckwith, Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Invisible Disabilities and Bias, Mental and Cognitive Disabilities, and today's presenter, Heather Hobbs-Woodard. Heather Hobbs-Woodard is a college English professor who has presented disability etiquette, sensitivity training, previously for Swiftland patrons as a webinar and in person. She is also an author, freelance writer, and business owner who has cerebral palsy and she's partially blind. Currently, she teaches virtual English classes at two colleges in the Birmingham, Alabama area, and she takes every opportunity that she can to show others that living a fulfilling life with a disability is not only a possible goal, but an attainable one. Mrs. Woodard graduated from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa with a Master's of Arts in English and a dual specialization in rhetoric and composition and American literature. Please help me welcome Heather and enjoy her webinar. Heather?
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be back with Swiftland to present part 2 of the hidden and not so hidden challenges of invisible disabilities. Part 1 concerned itself with various invisible physical disabilities. This webinar will concentrate specifically on working with patrons who have mental, emotional, and intellectual disabilities. And in many cases, as we'll see, this can be even harder, meaning that dealing with invisible mental, emotional, and intellectual disabilities can be even more difficult than dealing with physical disabilities. So we're going to really focus on what all of these may entail and how to best help these patrons. So I want to begin just by making a few general statements. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that living with any disability is really, really hard. It can be time consuming, it can be frustrating, it can be expensive. There are a myriad of elements that living with a disability entails that you can't really plan for. And I think this is even more of a challenge when you have an invisible mental, cognitive, or intellectual disability, because people are a lot less likely to give you the proverbial benefit of the doubt. So I want to start here by showing you a graphic that just lists in picture form, if you will, many of the mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions, all of which listed here. Well, within this graphic are listed all of the conditions that we're going to discuss. For example, we're going to discuss anxiety. We're going to discuss depression. We're going to discuss OCD. We're going to discuss ADHD. We're going to discuss PTSD, a lot of acronyms there. We're going to even take a look at schizophrenia. So there are so many mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions to consider. And that is one thing that I found when I was doing research for this presentation. I learned so much about just all of the potential complications and just different elements that if you don't live with these types of conditions, you probably would never consider them. So as we go along, of course, please feel free to ask questions via the chat box, and I will be more than happy to respond to you just as quickly as I can here. And one of the reasons that I told Luli that I was so glad to have an opportunity here is that many of my students over the course of my 23-year teaching career, I wouldn't say many, but a fair number of my students have had these conditions. And I've even learned a lot about dealing with these conditions from my students. And so I just wanted to pass along some knowledge here. Okay, so I'm going to start with just, again, some general myth and statements regarding people who have mental, emotional, and intellectual disabilities. And the first element here is that they do, like a lot of people with disabilities in general, encounter a lot of unfair stereotypes. And we're going to talk specifically about what some of those are. And they are stigmatized even more frequently and more harshly than physical conditions are. And I think this stems from a couple of different factors. One is just pure ignorance. People don't understand what all having a mental, emotional, or intellectual disability entails. And they find it really, really hard to accept the idea that these types of conditions are valid medically. And that is so frustrating because, as we'll see, there are a number of mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions that are actually neurological in origin. So, since that's the case, these are brain-based, if you will. I'm going to use that phrase loosely, but these are brain-based, and so this is not something that people can control. And I think that's also where societal misunderstanding and ignorance and fear and frustration come in. They think that for whatever reason that these people who have these mental disabilities, illnesses, conditions, they feel like you can control them. And in many cases, that is just not the case. And people have a tough time accepting that and understanding that. And I think this is also playing into my fourth point here. And that is that people feel that people should be able to handle these types of matters. And in some cases, that's just not true. If you have significant trauma, you're going to need help overcoming that. Okay, these are things not to say to someone with a disabling chronic condition. And I'll be honest with you, I have a visible physical disability, in my cerebral palsy. And I have been told these more often than I care to remember, especially when people who don't know me, they make these vapid comments. Well, oh, well, if you just got more exercise, maybe you could walk more easily, or you just need to tough it out. And that's just hurtful and it's counterproductive and it's unfair. So I just want to encourage you to think about, if you encounter a patron who has one of these conditions, they've probably heard these statements, and this is not something that you want to say. And I think the last statement here really summarizes it very well. It says, I wouldn't wish what I have on anyone, but unless you get it, you just don't get it. And that's really true for any disability. If you don't have the disability, you don't understand what it's like to live with that disability. Okay, why do people react this way toward people with invisible mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions? And we talked about this in part one of this webinar series on physical disabilities, and the same concepts apply, in my opinion. It's based on ignorance, it's based on fear, it's based on closed-mindedness, which is the idea that people have that the situation's not going to change or improve no matter what is said or done. It's based on shame. There's so much shame affiliated with both visible and invisible disabilities. But I would have to, if I were a betting person, and I'm not, but if I were, I would definitely bet that there are people with invisible disabilities who feel more shame than people with visible disabilities as a general rule. We talked about purposeful prejudice, which is ableism. And then there is just that desire for power and control over another individual. And that boils down to manipulation. It boils down to things like name calling. It boils down to purposeful taking away of supports, things of that nature. So again, there are a myriad of factors that would influence people to react negatively. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. I wanted to mention ableism again because I think it is more of an effect with people who have invisible mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions. So looking at the second point here. Generally, people with disabilities are assumed to be less worthy of respect and consideration, less able to contribute to and take part in society, and of less value than others. And I'm sorry to say that based on my research and based on personal experiences, anecdotes, stories that I've shared with students, and many friends that I have who have intellectual, mental, and emotional conditions, I think this is true. I think that those who are intellectually compromised, those who have mental illness, those who have emotional problems are even less valued and less understood than those of us who have visible physical disabilities. And again, I think it's because, say, for example, I'm out in public and somebody sees me in a wheelchair or somebody sees me on my crutches or my walker. If I ask for help, they understand that I need it. And 9 times out of 10, people are nice. If you give them a smile, if you present yourself and you ask for help, people are going to give it to you. Sure, I'll open the door or I'll hold this for you or whatever. But if people who have mental, emotional, intellectual conditions ask for help, they're made fun of, or they're outright denied help, or people don't take them seriously. And this is ableism. This is ableism at work. And moving forward, and I think this just is reinforced in the third point. Ableism can be conscious or unconscious, and it is embedded in institutions like education or the government, systems, or the broader cultural fabric or culture of society. And people with psychosocial disabilities experience unique forms of stereotypings because these conditions are so controversial and misunderstood. And those 2 points, I think, are key: controversial and misunderstood. People feel that those with mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions are faking them. And that's part of, I'm not going to say that everybody feels that way, but there is a higher incidence where people with these conditions get accused of faking it. They get accused of attention seeking. And again, people just don't think that their requests for help are valid. And so, of course, if they can't get help, then it's impossible to get treatment. And so things are not going to get better. And that is problematic. Okay, common forms of ableism. And again, this transcends barriers here between physical disabilities, visible or invisible, and mental / emotional / cognitive disabilities that are typically invisible. So many forms of ableism. It's embedded in the language. The one that I see most often is inaccessibility, where elevators are non-working, there are no ramps readily available. I mean, I have to call ahead if I want to go to a restaurant that I've never been to before and make sure that it's accessible. And if it's not accessible, then I have to find a way to either get in the restaurant and get help, or I avoid going altogether. And that's not fun. Transportation, it's a mistake to assume that everyone is able to drive or has consistent access to reliable transportation. And a lot of people with mental, emotional, and cognitive disabilities are isolated, sometimes even more so than people with physical disabilities, whether they're invisible or not. Indirect communication occurs when people talk through us instead of talking to us. So that's a problem. And then education, assumptions are made about students who utilize certain accommodations. I see this as a teacher all the time, and because I'm a teacher and because I've been through the system, I work really hard not to do this. But some teachers and students are not as aware as they should be on this. Okay, common negative consequences of ableism. And part of the reason that I'm including this in this particular webinar is because librarians are those public servants who could really encounter anyone. And so I just want to pass along some of the consequences that some of your patrons who have these conditions may encounter on a regular or even daily basis, and you are a service provider. So the common negative consequences of ableism, I've seen all of these myself as someone who is visibly disabled, but I'm also educated and I know how to advocate for myself. Many people with mental, emotional, and intellectual conditions are not as equipped to do so. They cannot navigate the world as effectively. They cannot advocate for themselves as effectively. So they're going to deal with all of these more than likely as well. Again, the lack of respect and consideration as a whole, that stems in ableism, hostility, very low self-esteem, bullying is pervasive because disabled kids are, again, used to being targets. I don't know how else to put that. And Julia, you're exactly right. The isolation is very tough. And all of these consequences tend to promote that isolation that I'm speaking of here. Pervasive discrimination, employment, housing, education, medical care, social activities. I've experienced multiple examples of this, particularly with regard to housing. That happened to me in college. With medical care, I have to really advocate and articulate for myself before some of my doctors have taken me seriously, particularly if they're not used to dealing with me. And then delay or outright denial of services. This happens all the time. I mean, and it can happen even when someone has verifiable proof that, hey, I've got this condition and this is what's been prescribed for me, or this is the treatment that a professional has deemed that I need. They still get the runaround and they still get denied. And it's really bad. I've just got to say. Okay, stereotype versus stigma. A stereotype is a set of beliefs, usually wrong, usually unfair, that all people who have a particular characteristic are the same. And that's the key here, folks. It's a belief that all people who have a particular characteristic are the same. And then a stigma is a set of negative and unfair belief that a society or a group of people have about something. And for disabled people, both of these apply at an appalling rate. We are subject to stereotypes. We are subject to stigma, and they both hold us back as a collective group. Okay. And I've given one example of a stereotype that applies to all people. And when you think about all people, that's a pretty high number. And then I've given an example of a stigma here that is a negative, unfair belief. And I myself, I had this lady at church before I went off to college, and I found out later that she had talked to my mom and told my mom that she might be sorry if she let me go off to college by myself. And my mom said, why? And this woman said, well, aren't you afraid that something may happen to her? And mom said, no, because I've prepared her, because she's smart, because she's outgoing. And I typically just try to ignore people who have these types of thoughts, but it's really hard to do so. And I find that as I get older, I actually lose patience, which is sort of bad, but it is what it is. And I just try to move forward. But because stereotypes and stigmas are so embedded in society, they are incredibly hard, if not virtually impossible, to get rid of. And then the reason that I wanted to highlight the idea of a stigma is because there are so many layers involved. And again, all of these elements tend to apply particularly to people who have invisible mental, emotional, and cognitive conditions, because people tend to take them less seriously anyway. But stigma exists when elements of labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination. So those are 5 different elements that are all interrelated. occur together in a power situation that allows them. So it's basically perpetrates harmful treatment and the tendency to blame. So stigma sometimes will blame the disability on the person who's disabled. I've had people tell me that I have cerebral palsy because I've got some kind of demon in me. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So it's unbelievable to me, and I haven't been told that in many years, but the fact that there are people out there that would believe that to me just seems incredible. And in the overwhelmingly vast majority of cases, those who are disabled do not choose to be disabled. And the reason that I say that is because every so often you will get the occasional story where someone purposely disables themselves for whatever reason. And I'm not a counselor or doctor, but to me, if somebody pours Drano in her eyes to blind herself purposely, or if someone purposely amputates a limb, that's a problem, and people who do this to themselves need help. So that to me is, again, I'm not a counselor or doctor, so I'm not going to diagnose, but there's definitely something going on there, because I've heard and read stories, isolated stories, of where this actually occurs, believe it or not. Common stereotypes and myths. Some of these we have talked about, and you can read the list here. It talks about everything that people believe that people with intellectual, mental, and emotional disabilities cannot do, or it talks about like a negative aspect. We're incapable of making sound decisions. They shouldn't live independently. They're unemployable. They're mentally unstable and violent. They can't experience emotion. They don't know when they're being made fun of or taken advantage of. That is incorrect. I'm here to tell you. And then, ironically, you do have people who think that these disabilities are often contagious or the result of heredity. I've even shared a story with Swiftlin about a young woman who I used to encounter in the library in college, who wouldn't come and talk to me because initially she was afraid that I was contagious. And I had to explain to her that I wasn't. And this was back in the 90s. So there are outdated ideas still out there. And then I've also mentioned that a lot of people think that these individuals act out solely for attention. It's not the case at all. Okay, we're going to begin speaking here about intellectual disabilities. And basically, an intellectual disability is an impairment in reasoning abilities that compromise someone's ability to function with regard to three major realms of thought. Those are conceptual, which deal with skills in language and literacy and reasoning, things like number concepts, memory. Social, compromise, empathy, social judgment, and interpersonal communication skills. And many people with intellectual disabilities particularly have difficulty with the social aspect. And we're going to talk about a couple of different disorders where this is the case. It's not that there aren't the conceptual and practical aspects that don't manifest themselves, but the hardest thing to deal with here is the social aspect. And then the practical aspect of self-management, like personal care, job responsibilities, money management, and general organizational tasks. Does anyone have any questions before we move further? Okay. I appreciate you guys keeping up with me here. So an intellectual disability, by and large, means that someone has a lower than average IQ, and so they're compromised in working with basic reasoning, social, and practical skills. Doesn't mean that they're not capable of learning. It doesn't mean that they can't achieve independence or higher goals. But a learning disability is a little bit different because it's specific. I shouldn't say it's a little bit different. It is different. A learning disability tends to be specific because those encompass weaknesses in specific skills or tasks. Reading, writing, and mathematics are common examples. I actually have a visual spatial learning disability because of my partial blindness, and I wasn't even diagnosed with that till I was 18 years old. So sometimes these invisible disabilities can sort of manifest themselves when you least expect it. And this is true in my case. For example, one can have really high verbal and language skills and below average mathematical ability. I would consider myself to fall in that category. Although I'm very good with basic math and computation, but when you look at stuff like geometry and trig, it's out of my wheelhouse. I had to get tutored in that myself. Okay, common intellectual disabilities, and I had to just sort of, Nancy, your question is whether autism would fit into both of these categories. That is a really, really good question, and I'm not a counselor, I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose, but based on my experience with students, based on my conversations with parents and my personal interactions with people who have autism, I would say that yes, it's highly possible that autism would fall into both of those categories. Although I think one mom who I talked to puts it best, and that is that autism is primary. Now, this is her opinion, and she, has a lot of experience with autism, has researched it. She reared her son who has autism, but she classified it as a socio-learning disability, which would then sort of fall under intellectual. I don't know if her son's IQ, I don't know what her son's IQ was or is. I don't know if he's above 100, below 100. So I can't really say whether he has an intellectual disability or not, but most parents that I speak with have classified it as either or both a communication disorder and or a learning disorder, which would then manifest itself in an intellectual aspect as well. And again, other developmental learning disabilities, they can really drag you down. And this is where part of the controversy comes in. Like, who classifies autism as a learning disability, who classifies it as a social disability, who classifies it as an emotional disability. The answers vary, to be honest, based on what I found. Okay, so how can you specifically help these patrons? There are a number of things you can do. You have to be patient, and this tests me as a teacher as well. To my knowledge, I'm a college instructor. To my knowledge, I have never worked with someone directly as a student who has Down syndrome, but I think it's possible that I could have, because all of my students now are virtual, which means I don't see them in person and I don't meet them. So even if they identify as disabled, I don't know what sort of disability they have unless they reveal that to me, and some do and some don't. So, but to specifically help patrons with Down syndrome, you want to be patient. You may have to repeat yourself. You're definitely going to have to ask very specific questions. And you're going to present concrete, specific ideas as opposed to abstract ones. One thing that might help patrons with intellectual/cognitive disabilities, you may want to see, if you don't have these already, you may want to see if you can gather some appropriate manipulatives or other technological tools, maybe get some specific apps or some specific programs or games that can help patrons. And you definitely want to provide strong visual cues whenever possible that show how others complete tasks. And I find that this helps my students. I make a lot of videos in my online classes, or I post them. I don't necessarily make a lot of videos, although I have made some, but I post a lot of videos that talk, for example, about the documentation process via MLA, because my students don't always understand that. So they need step-by-step instructions. And for some people, Worksheets help. For some people, handouts help. For some people, videos help. For some people, you just have to show them what to do. So be prepared to embrace any number of different types of learners, your kinesthetic learners, your visual learners, your auditory learners. And when you go from activity to activity, be sure to let your patrons know ahead of time, because if people with Down syndrome or autism for that matter are overwhelmed, like if you present too much information too quickly, they may just shut down and they may ignore you entirely. And it's not that they're being disrespectful, it's not their fault. Their systems, if you will, I use the term loosely, but their systems are overloaded. Okay, FXS, Fragile X syndrome. And the reason that I bring this up is because this particular condition often coexists with autism. And so many of us, all of us to some degree, are familiar with autism. We know at least something about it, but your Fragile X is closely affiliated with that. And notice the last 2 points here. The average IQ of boys with FXS is around 55. The average IQ of girls is between 75 and 90. Now that's a specific and significant difference to me. And I researched to try to find out what the difference was between genders, like why typically males with FXS have lower IQs and females have higher IQs. I'm not sure. I couldn't find a definitive answer, I'm sorry to say, but I did find out that males typically have more trouble reading, speaking, and avoiding self-destructive behavior. And I think this is because, well, at least the self-destructive behavior to me has to stem, at least to some extent, from the frustration that they would feel at not being able to, say what they want to say or do what they want to do or achieve what they want to achieve. When you're disabled, there are often times where you are frustrated. And that is a key component at some junctures. Okay. How to work effectively with patrons who have autism. And notice that some of the tips with autism and some of the tips with Down syndrome that I shared, sometimes they overlap. For example, look at the last point here, be specific and clear in giving instructions and feedback. That's so important. I mean, I can't even tell you how critical that is. And again, you're not going to know what to expect when you see a patron walk in the door. So you have to be prepared. It's like being a teacher. You prepare for different groups of students every single semester, and you don't know what you're going to get. It's like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. But in addition to being specific and clear in giving instructions, you can also keep in mind that you don't want to force communication. And the mom with whom I talked, whose grown son has autism, he's 25 now. And the main thing that she told me when I touched base with her on this, because I was like, how can I communicate to my Swiftland friends, what the best things are to remember, concrete things to help these patrons. And her big thing was, don't force communication. We prize eye contact in American society. It's a sign of respect and it's a sign of being taken seriously. But sometimes people with autism just can't manage that. They can't look you in the eye. It's too confrontational for them. And they have difficulty articulating their thoughts. They tend to repeat themselves sometimes, or their speech may be garbled when they're stressed. So big, huge thing. Don't force communication. Let it come to them. And sometimes, like I've had students who are autistic who have literally had to leave the classroom in the middle of a lecture. And the first time that happened, I was really taken aback. And I can remember one female student in particular. I asked her, so and so, are you okay? And she said, I had to go. I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to have a meltdown if I stayed in here one more second. And I asked her, I said, well, is it something that I said? And she said, no, it was just, there was so much information. You were going through PowerPoint slides, people were taking notes, and I reached a point where I couldn't handle it anymore. And so sometimes people just reach their limits. And not forcing communication, you can respect their desire for space. Literally give them their space, because if you go too close to them, they may be threatened by that. And then avoid raising your voices or showing panic or tension whenever possible. So if you get a little impatient or frustrated, and I have to say, I've been a teacher for 23 years, and I can't say that that's never happened to me. I would say that you take a deep breath and you just sort of take a mental 3 seconds and see if that helps you, because if you raise your voice or show tension, they may think you're yelling at them for something that they're not sure what they did. And so then that stresses them out even further. And you want to give consistent routine. My friend's son has a specific routine that he follows every single day when he comes in after being at work all day. And if he misses one step, she said he freaks out. So if you have someone with autism who comes in and they disclose that they have it, because sometimes they will, ask them specifically what they need. Do they need to go to the multimedia room first before they check out something else? Or do they have a specific section that they like to go to? Let them go to that. Let them develop their own routine. That's what they need. Any questions or comments? Okay, great. Okay, so some common learning disabilities we may be familiar with many of these: dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. I have the visual spatial perception deficit myself, and then the auditory and language processing disorders are often very closely aligned. In other words, if you have a language processing disorder or an auditory processing disorder, it's at least a bit more likely that you may also have the other. And then executive functioning difficulties simply refer to, maybe not simply refer to, but they refer to typically organizational tasks or sticking to a routine. And again, we've seen some of these pointers. How can you help patrons who have intellectual and learning disabilities? Again, be specific and methodical. Go step by step. And if you don't have a specific strategy to help patrons with intellectual and learning disabilities, consider developing one, because it's kind of one of those things where you never know when it could be helpful. And you want to promote successful, positive interaction. Use technology. People with disabilities love technology. It has revolutionized our world. And people with intellectual and learning disabilities probably aren't very different in that regard. They need technology. They use it. They're used to it. They're comfortable with it. Using common language and appropriate visual aids is very helpful. You want to be as short as possible, so you don't want to get into like convoluted, long, involved discussions. I mentioned using manipulatives to help, and then again, keep in mind you may have to repeat yourself. If you're a teacher, you're used to repeating yourself also. Okay, so moving from intellectual conditions, we're going to talk about mental illnesses. And I have a list here just some of those that have popped up more often in research. I've highlighted them there. And the thing with mental illnesses that we probably should remember is that various treatment options are going to be more useful than just one in the vast majority of times. So in other words, you have to have a plan of attack, and it's got to have multiple arms, if you will. Okay, so we did the graphic on learning disabilities. This is a graphic on mental disorders, but it's not just mental disorders, it's also complications that can stem from mental disorders. Again, the number of conditions that are labeled out there and diagnosed and accepted by science, it's mind-boggling. I learned so much when I was prepping this presentation. Okay, this is a mental health scale, and I bring this up because we all can identify with this. We've all been in situations and different elements where we felt pretty happy, pretty grounded, and then we've had some stress, and then we've had like an exceptional amount of stress. So to me, this is helpful because you may see a patron that, especially if they have a mental illness and that mental illness is manifesting itself, you literally could have a patient go from like 1 to 10 in a breathtakingly short amount of time. Like they could be perfectly happy 1 minute, and then something happens, something triggers, you're not sure what it is, but they could go to 8, 9, or 10 in a very, very short time. So I found this quite useful. And I remember thinking to myself when I first saw this, I wish I had had this for my 7th grade classroom 20 years ago, because I think it would have really helped the kids understand, the various scales and ranges of emotion. Because, when you're in 7th grade, the hormones are raging. When you're in high school, the hormones are raging. So to me, I just found this, I really identified with it. And I believe that everybody can relate to this in some form or fashion. Okay, prominent mental illnesses. These are the ones that we're going to focus on here for the majority of the rest of the presentation. Depression, anxiety, bipolar, ADHD, schizophrenia, OCD, panic disorder, PTSD. I know someone who is affected by every single one of these conditions, and I would be willing to bet that you probably are as well, even if you're not aware that someone has one of these conditions. These conditions are common. Okay. And I included some statistics here, but depression is a state of low mood and aversion to activity that can affect a person's thoughts, behavior, feelings, and sense of well-being. They can suffer a variety of negative effects, and it affects nearly 27 million people in the United States. So roughly 1 in 12 people have struggled with depression at some point, or do struggle with depression. And many of these people have other mental conditions in conjunction with depression. The most common condition that goes along with depression, or that coexists with depression, that I found was definitely anxiety. And if you look at the second point here, people with depressed mood can feel sad, anxious, empty, hopeless, helpless, worthless, guilty, irritable, ashamed, or restless. All of those can lead to anxiety. So you can help people who are depressed or anxious by projecting a deliberately welcoming attitude. If someone comes in and you say, "Oh, how are you doing?" And they say, "Well, I'm having a tough day, or I'm not feeling so good," you can respond in such a way, "Let me know if I can help." I always, when a student tells me I'm having a bad day, I I never ask if I can do anything specific because I don't know what they need. But you can say, let me know how I can help you. And, give them a smile, welcome them, maybe check on them more frequently. Like if they spend, a good amount of time in the library, check on them periodically, ask them if they need anything. In any case, letting someone know that you care is never a bad idea. Okay, general characteristics of depression. We've talked about some of these. And I think something that shows up, I know I've had students that have dealt with depression, and the last two items are really tough. And so, you can also encourage someone to get help. It's up to them as to whether they want to do it, but you can always ask someone, or not ask, but encourage someone to get help if they feel that they need it. That way, I feel good when I do that because I've at least covered my bases. Okay, different risk factors or treatments. Women are over twice as likely to go through depression, largely based on hormonal differences. And then you have various factors that could influence poverty or stress or anxiety, family history. One of the things that I found in researching all of these is that in the majority of these, heredity or family history at least had something to do with it. Maybe not in every single case, but luckily, depression is treatable. But you have to come up with an individual plan of attack for it, because not everybody's wired the same way, if you will. People react differently to different treatments. And the thing that we have to be careful of here is that if they start feeling better, they could stop treatment altogether. Anxiety affects even more Americans at any given point. With depression, it was 27 million Americans. Anxiety affects 40 million Americans at any given point. And it doesn't matter what the age is. Kids, teens, adults can suffer from anxiety, and this tendency has grown with the onset of social media and cyberbullying. And I would say that the way that you can help someone who seems anxious, there are certain cues that perhaps you could pick up on. If you see someone who seems rushed, if you see someone who seems just sort of stressed or tense, again, ask them, how can I help you? What can I do to assist you? Is there anything that I can get you? Again, showing someone deliberate attention and care is always helpful, because the thing with anxiety and depression and any of these other conditions that we're going to talk about, they don't just go away magically. You have to approach people as individuals without really knowing what they may be dealing with. And that's part of your challenge as librarians who work with the public. You never know who's going to walk in your doors. Okay, general characteristics. This is what I was saying in terms of, like things you can look for. Restlessness and tension, even nausea. If somebody comes and says, well, I think I'm going to be sick, ask them what they need. Encourage them maybe to leave and come back if they want to do so. Maybe they just need fresh air. But again, showing deliberate attention is going to go a long way toward helping someone with anxiety. Just letting them know that you're there. Risk factors and treatment. Again, look at the different risk factors that tend to overlap: being female, poverty, life trauma, family history, people who have mental problems, elevated hormone levels. All of these things combine and work together to exacerbate these conditions or to quicken the manifestation of these conditions, and you just never know. One of the things that you can do in your own library, perhaps, I know at least one of my schools, we have various rooms in our building where people can go if they need a minute to collect themselves, if they need quiet, if they just need to go in and decompress. So maybe one thing that you could do is consider setting aside a space or earmarking a space in your library for those patrons or those clients who, if they become stressed while they're working or if they seem stressed, is there a place where they can go to collect themselves? Is there a room or a corner that you can set aside to help these people? Maybe think about doing that, because you never know who could use that. Okay, bipolar disorder is a mental disorder characterized by periods of elevated moods and periods of depression. So this is significant because, again, in terms of energy, if someone is experiencing mania, they could go from 0 to 10 in seconds. And you can see the contrast between mania and depression. During mania, an individual feels or acts abnormally happy, energetic, or irritable. He or she often makes poor decisions with little regard to the consequences. But then during periods of depression, there may be crying, poor eye contact, and a negative outlook on life. So if you notice a patron who seems to exhibit these on either a periodic or a regular basis, like if you're a school librarian and you encounter the same student or group of students who seems to exhibit these characteristics, maybe keep in mind that this is something that they're dealing with and be prepared to offer assistance or, again, just your care and attention, extra care and attention to these patrons if they need it. I know as a teacher, I'm always acutely aware, because I will have students who come to me and they'll tell me, I'm super stressed. This is what's going on. I'm about to be evicted, or my husband lost his job, or whatever. So you just never know. And, one of the Scout mottos is be prepared. And I think librarians have to be prepared. Treatment and risk factors. There is no cure, but there are several treatment options, including therapy, medication, and support groups. There's a young woman with whom I go to church, and she's in college, and I'm really close to her. And she was just diagnosed with bipolar 2 years ago, and she is pursuing all of these treatment options, and they've made a 200% difference for this young woman. So treatment really can be a literal lifesaver. So if someone reveals to you, hey, I'm anxious, or I'm depressed, or I have this condition, if they seem open to it, maybe down the line, if they say, well, what do you think I should do? Suggest that they consider treatment. That's what I've done when students have come to me over the years. I'll say, have you considered counseling, or have you considered other forms of treatment? But you have to be super careful, because in working with adults, it's really up to them. The ball's in their court as to whether they want to share that information. ADHD, you see this a lot with children, school children in particular, but the thing with that is ADHD manifests itself well into adulthood. So again, if someone seems distracted or they can't stay on tasks very long, it's possible that they could have ADHD. And again, all you can do is just suggest that you're there for them if they need something, or if they could literally come to you and say, hey, do you have any information on ADHD? I just found out that I have this disorder. What materials do you have? So another thing you could do to help these patrons is maybe consider making sure that there are materials available for patrons to learn about these conditions. Maybe they've just been diagnosed, or maybe they'll come to the library and read up on something and then maybe go and get diagnosed. You just never know. Okay. Different treatments for ADHD, medication, behavioral modification practices, assistance with organizing. I have a mild ADHD issue myself, and I can remember when I was in junior high, I did all of these treatments, and it made a tremendous, tremendous difference for me. I was a different child in high school than I was in middle school because I was able to get treatment for ADHD. Schizophrenia, this one is tough. It's actually relatively rare because it's even misunderstood to a certain extent by medical professionals, but it's also it tends to be much more severe. And when you talk about schizophrenia, you're talking about delusions of grandeur, you're talking about hallucinations, and sometimes people with schizophrenia have these aspects and sometimes they don't. But the one thing that I noticed is that people with schizophrenia feel that they and their symptoms are not taken seriously by medical personnel. And I think it's because it tends to be misdiagnosed. It is hard to get diagnosed with schizophrenia. But, there are manifestations. People with schizophrenia may seem that they have lost touch with reality. You kind of have to tread carefully there. But again, if someone comes to you, I would say that this is unlikely, but if someone comes to you and says, hey, I've got schizophrenia, what can you tell me? Again, maybe think about having some material about schizophrenia in your library so that they can learn about it. General characteristics of schizophrenia: positive, negative, and cognitive. Negative, I noticed, deals specifically with behavior. Okay. When they're going into a negative symptom, they have issues speaking, they can't follow through with anything, and they feel depressed, for example. And then the losing touch with reality. I had one student who actually did hallucinate in class one time. And I wouldn't have noticed it if other students had not pointed it out to me. So that was a wake-up call. And I can remember asking the student the next class period when she came, I asked her if there was anything that I could do for her. And she said, no, I'm fine. She never had another episode, but I wondered if that was something that was going on with her. And I never did find out, but sometimes unexpected things can crop up like that. Again, you just never know when something's going to manifest itself. Risk factors and complications and different experiences with schizophrenia that people undergo. Again, delusions, hallucinations. It's rare that someone lashes out with schizophrenia, but it does happen. And it was really hard to find specific risk factors that dealt with schizophrenia because there's just not a whole lot out there that's very specific. But I noticed that having an older father was sort of interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. This is much more common. Obsessions have to do with feelings. Reactive behaviors and actions are compulsions. And OCD affects approximately 7 million Americans. I have a close family member who has OCD, and living with it is extremely difficult. Sometimes this person is fine. Sometimes this person is not so fine. And I have witnessed that, and it can be heartbreaking. Different symptoms of OCD. I thought this was interesting, and I think it's really helpful because this does a really good job of listing various symptoms. And one thing I notice is that not everyone who has OCD experiences all of these symptoms. Sometimes you can have just the obsessive thinking or just the drive for excessive cleaning. You know, some symptoms will manifest themselves. Sometimes you might see all of these. And people with OCD may seem rigid. So, say, for example, you have a patron who is just insistent on doing things a certain way or having, you know, certain forms of tools or products available, or just does not seem open to any sort of suggestion that you have to make changes in how they approach the library or what they do in the library. As long as they're not breaking rules in your facility, you might want to consider, if you want to help them, consider accommodating them to the extent that you can without compromising other patrons' safety or breaking your facility rules. Because it could be something as harmless, like, you know, maybe somebody with OCD will walk into your facility and insist on wiping down tables, for example, or wiping down the table where they're going to sit and do their work. You've got to decide, is that something you're willing to allow them to do? You know, that's up to you. I have had students that have had OCD, and I had one young woman in particular who was very, very obsessive about cleaning. So she would come in early. I made an arrangement with her where she came in early and she wiped down every single desk and chair in the classroom prior to our 8 a.m. class. And after that, she was fine. She did that every Tuesday and Thursday. And I thought, hey, that's something I don't have to do. But she did admit that she had OCD, and I said, well, what can I do to help you? And that's what she told me. So you can see where some of these general characteristics of OCD will assert themselves. My family member does excessive self-monitoring for sickness and disease, and he is very fastidious and meticulous about checking the house every single night. It's what he does. It takes him 20 minutes, but it's what he does. And he can't go to bed until it's done. Okay, risk factors and treatment for OCD. Again, similar tenets as many of the other diseases that we've talked about: family history, strong reaction to stress, presence of other anxiety disorders, heredity/family history. There is no known cure for OCD, although the use of medication and other treatments can lessen the effects. So again, think about treatment. Panic disorder. People with panic disorder have recurrent unexpected panic attacks, which may be characterized by any or all of the following factors, and you can see them listed here. Some of these panic disorder characteristics can actually be visible when you're looking at some of the physical aspects, like the sweating, the trembling, or the shaking. And to me, this is where if you have someone who's experiencing a panic attack in your library and you see someone beginning to sweat, tremble, or shake, I've had this happen in the classroom. You can go up to that person and ask them specifically, and I would whisper to them if you can, because you don't want to draw unwanted attention, but whisper to them, see if they actually need help, and then if they need help, just follow their lead as much as possible. But people with panic disorder fear losing control, and they tend to try to avoid situations, places, or things that trigger them, and that can be treated with medication, talk therapy, and modification of behavior. But again, if you encounter someone who worries excessively and shows physical manifestations of stress, just keep in mind that this is what they may be going through, and this is where your quiet area could help. This is where, you know, being very, very cognizant and purposeful about offering welcoming help. You just never know what could turn someone's day around. Risk factors with panic disorder. Statistically, approximately 1 million Americans experience a panic attack at least monthly. I would say that may be even more often than that. But again, you see where the risk factors and triggers tend to overlap themselves with other mental conditions that we've talked about. Everything is so interrelated here. People who suffer panic attacks are also much more likely to lose a job or experience a drastic decline in the quality of life. And that's, again, is where the library can come in. You are a safe place. Sometimes people literally may not have anywhere else to go. Panic disorder is closely related to post-traumatic stress disorder. It is triggered in almost 100% of cases by trauma. And sometimes people know what triggers panic, and sometimes they may not. Sometimes they just might have a feeling. Okay, Nancy asks, is there a way to tell if a customer is having a panic attack or a heart attack, as some of these symptoms seem to overlap? I don't know if there's a definitive way, Nancy, to tell that. I would just say that you want to be prepared to offer help. You know, suggest if it seems like they can leave safely, you may want to suggest that they leave the facility and come back later, or you may suggest that they go to the quiet area if you have one, or you can just ask specifically, how can I help you? But I would say there's probably not a way to tell whether somebody's specifically having a panic attack or a heart attack. I'm not a doctor or counselor, but I wouldn't think that there's a way unless somehow they can tell you. And you're right, a lot of these symptoms do seem to overlap. That's something I noticed as well. But PTSD is almost always exclusively tied to a traumatic event or series of traumatic events. And I found it pretty shocking that it affects between 7 and 8% of the population. That's a lot. Okay, common triggers of PSD. We've all heard stories of war, assault, abuse, witnessing murder. I can't imagine anything more traumatic than that. Death, bullying, torture, natural disasters. You know, in the South, in Florida and Alabama, I mean, we deal with natural disasters pretty regularly, and I've seen manifestations of that as well, where people do experience PTSD as a result of what they went through in a natural disaster, and it doesn't surprise me at all. Stages and effects of PTSD, reliving the event. I talked about the avoidance, and then the numbing happens when people just shut down, because they don't know how else to cope. They're not up to literally interacting with people. And then in hyperarousal, people are extremely watchful, always on the alert for danger, and extremely vigilant. And I've seen some of these particular characteristics manifest themselves in other mental conditions as well. The hyperarousal. Various complications of PTSD, or these are things that can cause PTSD or things that people can experience as a result of PTSD. Your substance abuse, your outbursts, your self-blame, relationship difficulties, employment problems, pain, physical pain, suicidal thoughts. There's just so many things that can possibly come as a result of these conditions. And then different treatments for PTSD. Again, I would say that you've got to have a multi-armed plan. It's always better to think about approaching treatment from multiple angles than just one, if at all possible. And so again, that's something that you can do. If someone comes to you and says, I've got this, if you know that person, I would say you can encourage them to the extent that you're comfortable, encourage them to pursue some sort of treatment or some sort of plan to alleviate the problem as much as possible. Okay, how can you assist patrons with mental illness? And again, we've seen some of these specific tips in other sections of this webinar. Project a deliberate, welcoming attitude. Monitor your involvement level. Sometimes you may have to become a little more involved than you would otherwise. And then definitely if someone does ask for help, you always want to respond, and you always want to be specific in saying, how can I help you? And sometimes they may not know, but you can still ask. And then you're going to look for opportunities to interact positively. And then this is something that I had to learn as a teacher that sometimes is challenging. Don't call out behavior unless doing so is actually necessary. It's embarrassing. If you call out someone for something that seems unusual, it may not be unusual for them. So unless you have to call out behavior, like unless they're breaking rules in your facility or they're impeding the safety of other patrons, I would say be careful about calling out behavior, and then seek help if and when it becomes necessary. And I've had to actually call the police and have a student escorted from my classroom. So I would say you can do something extreme as far as seeking help if the situation escalates to the point where you feel that, again, people's safety are affected or is affected. But again, that has to be your call. And then I've given a list of citations here. The links are there. And by the way, I'm sure you can get a copy of this webinar from Swiftland staff if you wish to do so. And I would love to have any or all of you contact me if there's anything else that I can do to assist you in training, or if I can clarify any questions that you have. This is my contact information. Please feel free to email me. I would love to correspond with you. And I thank everyone for your attention, and I thank Swiftland for allowing me to come in and share this information with you. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Okay, if nobody has any questions, thank you, Heather, for an informative webinar. Attendees, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, Swiftland Facebook page, or your messages from the listserv for more training. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a terrific rest of your day.
Thank you all so much for allowing me to work with you. I really enjoyed it.